Hello, hello. Welcome to the Takedown, Subverting Power, Radical Thought. I'm your host, Nick Nowlin. I'm glad to basically come on tonight. And tonight I want to have a special conversation. I have a special guest with us, Professor William Darity from Duke University. Say hello to our guest. Say hello to our audience, Professor, and kind of introduce who you are and what you do.
Good evening, everybody. I'm William Darity. I'm a faculty member at Duke University. I direct the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity, and my research is focused primarily on the problem of inequality, particularly between groups, interracial inequality, interethnic inequality, patterns of inequality by gender, patterns of inequality by religious affiliation, and other kinds of social markers.
That's actually incredible because, originally the intent, when I hear that between groups, I think of this definitely the racial aspect, but it's very, very different when you start thinking of about from all the things by which people can be grouped and see disparity. And that's very interesting. So
yeah.
Here's this is a wide topic and there's tons of stuff to talk about here, but I want to kind of basically we're going to just start from square one. And I think the reason why it's best to kind of start from square one is due to my conversations with people. So when I talk to people about specific things, it seems to me that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of kind of like not necessarily how the world works or how things, well, really it is like how things work here in America and like the circumstance we find ourselves in and why. And I think that's why it's particularly important to have you on and basically start to try to discuss some of these things and how they work. And I think the first thing, whenever I'm talking about race in America, the first thing somebody will say to me is that, well, all the things that happened to Black people were a long time ago and they don't really have an effect today. And that's just, it's a strange argument that people make. And I want you to kind of take us through why that may not be the case or why it's really not the case, to be honest.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm not sure how anybody can make that claim in light of all of the information we have about police violence against unarmed Black folk. The degree of insecurity that Black people face today is probably not significantly different from the degree of insecurity that we faced 60 or 70 years ago in the United States. In addition, the overt displays of enthusiasm for the Confederacy and for the lost cause that we've witnessed recently, Charlottesville, Virginia would be one example. That's another indicator that maybe not very much has changed. But I'm an economist, and so what I would tend to focus on is the various kinds of indicators that are associated with the economic well-being of the Black community. And I would argue further that the relative position of Blacks in terms of unemployment, in terms of income, in terms of wealth, in terms of business ownership, self-employment, and the like, the relative position for Black folks has not changed very much since the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Now, that's a very, very strong argument. I've even heard people make claims that, we in some aspects have started to slide backwards.
Yeah, that is an argument that can be made, particularly with respect to wealth. We have not regained the relative wealth position that we had as a community prior to the Great Recession. So there appears to be some mild uptick in the relative position of Blacks with respect to wealth. I think moving from approximately 7 cents to the dollar for whites, for 7 cents for Blacks in comparison with $1 for whites circa 2013 to about 10 cents now. As of the 2016 data, but that's still not back to the levels that existed prior to the Great Recession, and those levels were low. So Black people have rarely had more than 12 or 13 cents to the dollar of net worth that whites have held at the median.
And so what you're thinking of when you say this is like we haven't really made any ground or gained anything or moved up in any real way systemically, right? You're
Yes.
saying that, even though things like Jim Crow and anti-discrimination laws are passed, their relative effect has not. I mean, effectively, they really haven't done much if we're still in the same relative position. If that was their goal, was to change our relative position and integrate us into the economy as a whole.
Well, I mean, if we're thinking about inequality, then we have to be concerned about our relative position. That is, how our position compares with those of the reference group, the social group that's historically been dominant in the society, which is white Americans. And so it's not sufficient if we observe some sort of absolute improvement. You know, if there are more middle class blacks today than there were 20 years ago, but there are more middle class whites in the same proportion than there were 20 years ago, then our relative position hasn't really changed. And that's what we have to be focused on. And you know, the sad story is that there's not much evidence that we've we've achieved any kind of significant change in that relative position over the course of, say, at least the past 50 years.
Now, I guess implicit in my response to people when they make these arguments is something similar to yours, but there's a fundamental misunderstanding that kind of hinted at earlier in the conversation when we first started. And that is, you know, the the position that you are in today is highly correlated to the position of your parents and their position correlated to the position of their parents and so on and so on. Can you kind of go into that and explain a little bit why or just some of the data that kind of outlines that trajectory?
Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize at the beginning of this process that I think that wealth or net worth is the most important indicator of the economic status of a household or a family. And by net worth, I mean the difference between the value of what you own and what you owe, or put slightly differently, the difference between the value of your assets and your debts. And net worth is what constitutes wealth, and it's the primary source of economic security and economic opportunity for any household, particularly in terms of the opportunities that are provided for the next generation. And so the point that you're making is quite apropos to the extent that my parents or grandparents have less resources that they can contribute to me, then then the more disadvantaged my position will be over time. The more restricted the opportunities that I face, the less of a capacity I have to meet financial emergencies, the less of a capacity I have to initiate new projects like trying to start my own business or engage in self-employment, the less opportunity I have to purchase high quality education. And so in some sense, the deficits of previous generations are visited upon the current generation, and they're visited upon the current generation in a racially disparate way. And that's because previous generations of African Americans have been denied the capacity to accumulate the same types of resources that are held by many white American households.
Can you give us some examples of what you mean when you say that?
Examples of the denial.
Yes, examples of issues where Black folks were perhaps denied the ability to accumulate wealth.
So let's start with the fact that that blacks in the United States were supposed to have received 40 acres and a mule immediately after emancipation took place. And that never occurred. That in fact, to the extent that any land was distributed to African Americans, huge amounts of that land were actually restored to the former slave owners. And so the capacity to have your initial grub stake in America was denied. And if 40 acres had been provided, that means that the 4 million ex-slaves would have received at least a total of 40 million acres of land. Okay.
$40 million? Oh, I'm sorry.
40
Yeah, you're right.
million
40 million
acres
acres,
of land. Okay.
distributed amongst the people that were
So
emancipated.
yeah, if the promise of 40 acres had actually been delivered, but it wasn't. And so it's interesting to note that somehow, by dint of their own initiative, Black folks, particularly Black folks in the South, did manage to acquire up to about 15 million of acres of land by the early 20th century. And actually, this is a remarkable story in its own right, and one that needs to be told time and again. But 15 million acres of land is actually, roughly a third of the 40 million acres that were supposed to have been distributed to the ex-slaves in the first place. And then subsequently, what happens to the accumulated property that Blacks had at the beginning of the 20th century? Well, so we have a number of white terror campaigns that resulted in massacres in cities where you had prosperous Black communities that resulted in the destruction of those communities. And so that's one way in which wealth was eliminated. You also had a process of seizure of land by white terrorists in the South, driving people off of their land, actually destroying records of the actual deeds to the property, so that the properties would ultimately be transferred to white folks. And so when we get to the 1970s and 1980s, Black land ownership had declined to roughly about 1 million acres in the South. In addition, in the aftermath of World War II, the most substantive policies to provide upward mobility in the United States were introduced in the forms of the GI Bill, and also in the form of subsidies for home mortgage purchases or for home mortgages to facilitate the growth of a middle class. But it facilitated the growth of a white middle class because the application of these programs was conducted in a decentralized manner. And in much of the South, the agencies that were responsible for providing these kinds of options systematically denied those options to Black Americans. So the one big opportunity after World War II for upward mobility was one that was disproportionately provided to whites in the United States and not Blacks. So those are some of the major factors that I can think of immediately that explain why Black wealth is so low today.
Now, part of a big deal, and well, actually a major part of what you were talking about there was focused on land and property. How important is land and property or asset accumulation? And, how important is that to necessarily grow one's wealth intergenerationally?
Well, I mean, yeah. So if we think about the possession of land, I think people frequently associate this exclusively with farming. But the possession of land has a vast array of options that it provides individuals with. And if you think about it, the probably the most highly valued land in the United States may be on the island of Manhattan. And I think a recent estimate that I saw suggested that a square foot of land in Manhattan is valued in excess of $3,000. And so there's no farming or significant amount of farming that's taking place in Manhattan. The value of land there is associated with residential properties, corporate properties, commercial properties, and the like. And so if you own land, then you always have the option of trying to develop the land in a variety of ways, which creates the intense value for land holdings. So I think it's important that people disassociate the automatic link between land ownership and farming, and think about land ownership as providing a much wider range of options, which accounts for its value.
Interesting enough, I think when we talk about things like intergenerational wealth, we also forget about timing. So, when you were thinking about that timeline that you were going through, not just 5 or 10 minutes ago, it seemed to me that in America there were specific phases of kind of like colonization and basically manifest destiny and things of that nature. Like, it seems to me that emancipation happened, and as long as land was plentiful and very, very cheap in the United States, because it was such a large country and most of it had not been settled yet, it seemed that people were tolerant of Black people owning land. But once it began to move into a scarce thing or become something that's profitable or valuable in some way, shape, or form, it seems that then you start to see a lot of predation.
Well, I also think that the predation is associated with the recognition that as a community gains more economic resources, it can also exercise more political influence. We live in what is effectively a plutocracy. So, the dollar kind of rules the day in terms of political outcomes in our society. So, if there was any concern about Black political strength, that would be another reason to try to curtail Black economic achievements or Black economic success. So I think that goes hand in hand with the kind of process that you're talking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so now we kind of covered a little bit of, kind of what happens in the past. And so when I'm explaining stuff to people, generally I try to come at it from an angle of, hey, if we understand that what you have is directly correlated with what your parents had, why is it so hard to understand that descendants of slaves here in the United States, descendants of slaves and discrimination, also incur hardship from their parents, just as you incur benefits from your parents.
Well, I think one of the problems is that individuals don't always recognize that their economic position is closely tied to the kinds of economic possibilities that their parents or grandparents might have provided them with. So I remember there's a very interesting study that Dalton Conley did, where he interviewed a large number of families who we might call middle class. These are white families primarily. And it's interesting because people would describe the various ways in which their parents might have assisted them or supported them in the process of acquiring a home or acquiring education. Uh, in particular, acquiring a debt-free education. Uh, Parents might have helped them. If they have tried to start up a business, their parents might have given them some initial financial support to help them in that way. But when you reach the final point of conclusion about this, the folks would invariably say something to the effect that they earned their wealth. And I think that's a confusion between the individual effort that they had put out and the compounding benefits that they got from the financial support that they received from their parents or other relatives. And so I think people frequently just don't even recognize the extent to which they've gotten support from the other generations. And one example is the fact that a debt-free college education really is a form of a gift, a transfer from the older generation to the next generation. But most people think, well, that's what my parents are supposed to do. Well, maybe, but there are parents who would like to do that who aren't capable of doing it because they don't have the resources that would permit them to support their kids in that way.
That's an actual great point. And let me ask you a question then. How can we start to get some kind of breakthrough there to to get people to understand kind of like where they are versus, what's really their individual effort and what's really, just building upon a position that they were born into.
Yeah, that's very difficult. That's a great question. I'm not sure I have an answer, particularly in a world in which so many things that are not true are things that people believe. Um, this is the alt fact society. But, I would add that what's even more troubling is that people have mistaken beliefs about the economic status of Black Americans, both blacks and whites. And people have had those mistaken beliefs for quite a while now, long before the existence of operations like Breitbart. If you go back to the late 1970s and early 1980s, there are studies that demonstrate that at that point, white Americans, the majority of white Americans actually believed that blacks had caught up with them or were actually ahead of them in terms of economic well-being. There's absolutely no statistical evidence to support that kind of position, but that's what people believed. So I'm not really sure how you break through this except by continuing to try to push for the most factual and accurate picture of the situation. Hopefully people will begin to listen.
Yeah, and to your point, I know Black people, a lot of them college educated, some of them not. But when you try to stress the fact that we as a people are poor, even they're resistant to the idea that they're not poor. And I'm like, well, we went to college. Did your parents provide anything for college? Like, just suppose that with some people that we know, and I'll name names that we know, it's like his parents were able to pay for him to go to college. Her parents were able for her to she was able to go and study abroad, paid for by her parents. And yet you want to believe that, you're the same as her because you can buy a TV or you can drive a similar car. And it's just like, that's not what that means. They have resources and wealth and networks that we don't have. And that's what kind of separates us in a sense. So I think we have to make sure we keep a collective understanding of the differences between African Americans and relative to white people.
Yeah. I think that one of the key things that people tend to confuse is income and wealth. So there are Black folks who earn relatively high incomes, but frequently they still don't have a significant amount of wealth. What wealth would do is if there was a shortfall in their income for whatever reason, medical emergency, temporary loss of a job, etc., if they had significant wealth, they could weather that storm fairly easily. But in the absence of significant wealth, if there's an income shortfall, if they lose a job or if they're faced with an unexpected high expense, then they are going to be reduced very quickly from being middle class to being a lower income family. And so I think folks have to begin to realize that having what appears to be a high income is not necessarily the same thing as having a high level of wealth, and that the two have very different kinds of effects on the status or welfare of a family.
Yeah, like whenever I think of wealth and income, it's stock versus the flow. You know,
Right.
Generally, I'll
Right.
say things along the lines of, hey, if you have a high income but you spend a lot of money, your net wealth may not be very high. And really looking at income as like the soul of inequality is really like trying to look at inequality in an instant.
Right.
Whereas you really
Right.
need to look at it over
A
time.
snapshot view of inequality
Yeah,
rather
you're looking like
than
at an
a
instantaneous
long
view
view of inequality.
versus,
Yeah,
really. Go
yeah,
ahead.
that's exactly right. I think we also have to keep in mind, though, that it's wealth that begets wealth, so that you can't really generate huge amounts of wealth out of your personal acts of saving. You certainly can't generate, as Black folks, a sufficient amount of wealth out of your personal savings to close the racial wealth gap. And here's why. Uh, I think the most recent data from the Survey of Consumer Finances for 2016 indicates that the median level of wealth for white households is in the vicinity of $171,000. So that's the middle of the distribution. That's the middle household. That's a white household. The middle household among blacks has about $17,000 in net worth. And so it's a 1-to-10 ratio effectively. And if black folks were going to close the racial wealth gap by their own personal acts of savings, the average white household would have to save 100% of their income for 3 consecutive years to close the gap that I've just described. Now, that's clearly an impossibility. But what's also interesting is our best evidence indicates that if you take into account the family or household's income, there's no significant difference between black and white savings rates. So black folks are not more profligate. They just have lower levels of income on average and considerably lower levels of initial wealth.
Yeah, that's an interesting. What I was going to say when I was talking about stock versus the flow is that wealth inequality is the accumulated effect of income inequality over a period of time, over a long period of time. So that's become a huger issue in my mind than income inequality, because I think we have now an instance where maybe incomes are starting to narrow some. Maybe I don't even believe that, but we're still seeing that the effect
there
of
actually is no
wealth.
significant change in relative incomes between blacks and whites between 1967 and 2017.
Okay, so see, and that's why I said I don't even believe that. But
yeah,
you see, more things are moving towards wealth, like the increasing cost of college education. You're going to see fewer and fewer people able to afford that, but because we don't have wealth, fewer and fewer people are able to graduate debt free. But when you have wealth, it still mitigates the effect of this increased cost.
Yeah, the commentator Antonio Moore has made a very interesting point, and his argument is that we are misled about the economic status of Black Americans by the prominence and attention that's given to celebrities. So, we had a Black man as president of the United States for 8 years. Some celebrity figures who are quite wealthy. But the problem is, just like the wealthiest folks among whites, they are huge outliers in our community. And they don't represent anything approximating the typical experience of most Black families. So, we should not be deceived by the visibility that's given to some of our Black celebrity figures. What really stone for our attention is the wealth position of the average Black household in comparison with the average white household.
Yeah, I think I've seen him when he made that comment, and I think also, since you brought up Barack Obama, we have to think about how many Black individuals, how many Black young adults or young adolescents or whatever are sent to the best schools in whatever respective state that they live in, private, and at 18 inherit $500,000 in wealth from a relative. It's like when Barack Obama tells a young child that he too can be Barack Obama, there's a lot of things that went to make Barack Obama that your average run-of-the-mill Black person just doesn't have. So it's just really an impossibility, and I think it plays more to a fantasy than anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, including the racial privilege of his mother's side of the family.
Yes. I mean, that's a given, right? Because in order to get those things, that's where it comes from. That's the source, so to speak. So I think Antonio's definitely on to something there, especially when he says that we're misled by Black celebrity, because in our minds, the familiar becomes like the truth, and so we see these lives of individuals living in huge houses, multi-story houses, 4,000 square feet, in the Northeast. And it's like, Black people just really don't live that way. That's not a real
Yeah, I
representation.
mean,
And I'm in the South.
really, most white people don't live that way either. Uh,
Exactly. Exactly.
but the proportions of whites who do are much higher.
Yeah, I think I rub elbows with some people, and when they tell me that they have a 4,000 square foot house, I'm shocked and surprised. You know, I'm like, that's a huge house. What is that for?
Yeah,
And
I mean, yeah, for a single family. I mean, what do you do with that amount of space? I don't know, but that's all right.
it's just we have to be reminded. I think, and sometimes even though we know, we might forget, or it may not be as apparent to us until like we run into certain things like that. Here we are, both professionals, but there's a profoundly different life that one person leads versus the other. So I think that that's something, again, that's proportionate to, what resources your parents had, where you went to school, and what access to opportunity you end up with as a result of an accumulation of those things.
I agree.
So another big thing that I hear from people a lot of times is, and I think this goes back to the income versus wealth analysis that you just gave not too long ago, but he'll say, like, when you're making reparations arguments, when you have Black professionals, that you really can't make that argument because they themselves were not harmed by discrimination, since they are a professional. And what would you say to that argument?
I think that's silly. I think that if anything, their professional success would probably be greater than it is if there was if there was no discrimination. The fact that people have achieved something doesn't mean that they haven't been subjected to discrimination. It just means that they have managed to overcompensate for the kinds of obstacles that they've been confronted with. Or sometimes there's a substantial dimension of luck that's involved as well. But I know that there's a tendency among Black folks to engage in what Sherman James would call high effort coping. That is to say, they recognize that they're faced with greater barriers or obstacles. And so, frequently you'll hear parents say to their children, Black parents say, for you to achieve as much as somebody who's white, you've got to be twice as good. So to the extent that we engage in this high effort coping, it creates some other penalties for us, particularly penalties that are associated with our health. It can easily be made. It can easily be argued that the reason why we have elevated levels of hypertension in the Black community is a consequence of the kinds of stresses that we encounter in the process of undergoing high effort coping for the purposes of trying to achieve in the face of discrimination. So just the observation that people have done well or appear to have done well doesn't at all say that they're not subjected to discrimination. Now, we could make the case that the folks who are least well off in the Black community ought to have access to more resources from a reparations program. But I absolutely do not think that we should say that Black folks who have been successful professionally don't merit reparations also.
Now that is an interesting argument to make. I mean, I agree with that. Obviously, a one size fits all approach would not be necessarily the best thing to do, right? But at the same time, where we're trying to go is relative position, right? So we should be trying to get people into some sort of relative position to their counterparts. So you still have to address all people who are aggrieved, not just one particular subsection.
Yeah, and all Black Americans have been subjected to the have been subjected to having had ancestors who were enslaved in the United States, having had ancestors who were subjected to legal segregation in the United States, what we call Jim Crow. There's some of us who are in my age category who directly experienced the Jim Crow period. And of course, we all who are living are encountering the sustained processes of discrimination and racism on a day-to-day basis. So I think that that's something that applies to all Black folks in the United States, Black Americans, and as a consequence, reparations is appropriate for all Black Americans.
That's a very strong argument, but I think it's the right argument that needs to be made. Now we're going to kind of shift gears. So we come into the political aspect where we have a situation where I think in many cases, some of the same arguments that I made here today, like, this was a long time ago. And you just mentioned that, you're old enough. And what I mean to say by that is you were alive, not necessarily that you're old, that you were alive to experience some of Jim Crow. I think that goes to say that that was really not that long ago. So I really don't think that that's an appropriate argument to make. But, again, the fundamental understanding of kind of where we are today versus, where we have been or where we are and why is key. But in forging new alliances and things of that nature to make these things happen, because these are political problems, you already stated that no amount of individual striving or, what do you call it? High effort coping.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to change the situation for the mass of Black people. I think what that ends up with is, like you said, based on a variety of factors. Sometimes it's just raw luck. You end up with a couple of individuals, that are very, very successful, but that's not really a strategy necessarily for everyone, right? But the way our system works is because those people are successful, they kind of are weaponized in a way to say that the reason why everybody else is not successful is because they didn't work as hard, or they didn't do the things that they did, not even applying the fact that not everybody can do the same thing.
That's a perfect term to use, weaponized. I think that's exactly right. And it's interesting because that type of argument is made to essentially place the responsibility for the inequalities that Black folks face back on Black folks. A claim that Black people are less motivated, they're put forth less effort, when actually it's quite the contrary. In fact, we know now that for a given level of household income, young Black people get more years of schooling and more credentials than young white people who come from families with comparable levels of resources. And here we're talking about the educational background of the parents, and we're talking about the income level. If you were to take wealth into account, you would have an even stronger case of Black accomplishment relative to resources that outstrips white accomplishment with respect to education. And furthermore, Black parents provide some support for their kids' higher education with, on average, 1/3 of the median wealth that white parents who provide no support for their kids' higher education have. So I mean, this is very striking in the sense that it makes for a clear picture that that Black Americans are highly, highly motivated to gain additional educational attainment, and are generally highly motivated. When we look at research on motivation, we find that if you take into account family income, once again, Blacks display more expressive indicators of being highly motivated than whites.
Now, that's again, we have a situation where we say what alternate reality or alt facts. We're in a world now where the Black man is lazy, and
right,
shiftless and lacking moral fabric, and that's why we don't achieve very much. and that's why
Right.
our communities are the way they're. We live in what did it, somebody told me one time, a
Or our
culture of
kids are
violence.
afraid of being charged with acting white if they do well in school. I mean, there's so many of
Oh
these
yeah, who
ridiculous
said that? Thomas
arguments
Sowell.
that have purchase and currency.
I mean, these types of arguments are not very new arguments. The Negro has always been shiftless and lazy and lacking moral fiber. Lacking lacking morals ever since
Right.
they came up with an
Well,
ideology to
that's
support the
why slavery
subjugation.
was a school for civilization, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Ever since they came up with an ideology to support slavery, we've always been lazy and shiftless
Yeah.
and lacking morals. So I think what we're coming up into now is a situation where it's just like, okay, we've been taught something that's just incorrect. Society teaches something that's just incorrect. By the face of it, I think we need to start recognizing that we do have a problem and we do have to do something about it. And that something is going to be disproportionate in terms of like not being a universal program, or if it's going to be a universal program, perhaps being some sort of racially conscious universal program that would take into account, where the relative positions of groups are. And what do you think about that?
So I'm an explicit advocate of reparations for Black Americans, but also realize that we could accomplish some of the objectives of that with a universal program. I don't see a universal program as being a substitute for reparations, because I think there's also a principal dimension to a reparations program that that is intended to address the history of injustices and the ongoing injustices that confront Black Americans. But in addition to a reparations program, we might have a program that I call the Baby Bonds Project, which is one in which Derek Hamilton at the New School and I have argued that we would provide every newborn infant, Black or white or Asian or Native American or Latina or Latino, we would provide every newborn infant in the United States with a trust fund, federally funded trust fund. So instead of having a situation where only rich parents give their kids trust funds, every child would have a trust fund, and the amount of the trust fund would vary with the wealth position of the family. So if a child was born into the wealthiest families in America, we'd give them a $50 trust fund. But for children who are born into the families with the lowest levels of wealth, we'd give them a $50,000 to $60,000 trust fund. And then the accounts would be available to the kids when they reach adulthood at age 18. And we would guarantee a 1% real rate of increase on the accounts over the course of the 18-year period when the account is maturing. And then, this gets back to your observation about race conscious policies. So this would be a universal program. So it would apply to all American children, but it would not be a uniform program, since the amounts of the trust funds would be graduated based upon the economic status of the child's family. So this means in turn that although it would not be a race-specific program, it would be a race-conscious program in the sense that it would disproportionately benefit the groups that have the lowest levels of wealth on average, and thereby disproportionately benefit Black Americans. So everybody gets the benefit, but the benefit would go most strongly to those groups in the community or in the national population who have the least.
It's interesting. Why would you say that? And this is not my own personal opinion. I was just kind of going through it right there. But why would you say that a universal program or universal programs are not a substitute for reparations?
I think in large measure because universal programs will not necessarily address the historic injustices that have been visited upon the Black community. A program like the baby bonds can always can do something to correct generation by generation disparities that are persisting, and it would be disparities that are persistent across all groups in the society. But the reparations program would be specifically intended to address the unique or particular set of injustices that have been experienced by Black Americans, and I think that that's not something that can be accomplished by a universal program. I'd also like to add, you made the point that frequently people talk about slavery being so long ago. Well, that's one of the issues that Kirsten Mullen and I are going to address in our book. So I urge people to look at what we have to say about it being so long ago. But I'd like to also add that we are still living with the principles and beliefs of the Confederacy. That's something that we experience and encounter every day. In my most depressed moments, I sometimes will say that it is actually the Confederacy that won the soul of America, even though they lost the war. And so, insofar as we continue to live with the ideology of the lost cause of the Confederacy, and to the extent that this affects our daily lives in terms of providing the fundamental pillar for white supremacy in the United States, then slavery is not so long ago in that sense.
That's a very, very clear message. Like I've seen people say, I would love to forget racism if it wasn't thrown at my face every day, reminding me constantly every day and almost, multiple aspects of my life, that I'm just not the same as a normal white person. So, excuse me, I said that wrong. As a normal person, that I'm not a person.
Well, I mean, there's a sense in which the whiteness is the normal.
Yeah, but I said it all jacked up, like it was almost like self-hating or something like that. I didn't mean it like that, guys. Don't get mad at me. I'm just trying to kind of formulate my thought while I'm still shaping the conversation. Sometimes I get my words tripped up, as you can see. But I think you are definitely right when you say that we're still living kind of with the ideology of the Confederacy. Like, even though some people may be against it, like they've been socialized into accepting it as like, it's a norm to say the Confederacy is just a part of our history, and we have these statues up just to remember the history, rather than making an honest acknowledgement that the statues are there to memorialize and honor an ideology or the deeds and things that person stood for, and that person stood for racialized subjugation of
Right.
Black people and Native Americans in many respects. So like, that's basically what you're honoring when you have those statues there. And no amount of saying, well, it's just our history is going to change that. And deep down, you probably know it.
Right.
So I definitely agree with you there. And the reason why I want to kind of bring the last portion of the conversation, because we're down like our last couple of minutes, is because, oftentimes I feel like when people come to Black people and they only want to do a universal program, it's not as attractive because there's a history of coalitions being made with Black people under universal programs, but we never really actually get the benefits from those programs. And sometimes we're often cut out, or after people are elevated, the program is kind of like left to wither and die because too many Black people are using it or something along that line. And I think that's kind of why I think the progressive community in particular politically need to kind of embrace a reparations program strongly and emphatically to really shoulder up or to really broaden their support among Black people generally.
I absolutely agree. And I think that one of the reasons why we are in the situation we are now with the results of the election of 2016 is because I guess what we're calling the progressive community was extremely, extremely timid prior to the election of 2016. The types of policies that they advanced were rarely bold. They were almost always incremental. And I think that that created a climate in which it was opportune for folks on the right to say, okay, we are going to do something bold and dramatic, and that appeal to wide swaths of the American electorate. So I think it is a propitious time now to come up with a general program of change in the United States that would include things like a reparations program for African Americans, a baby bonds proposal. Derek Hamilton and I have also talked about a federal job guarantee. Come up with a package of proposals that really will be transformative for American society.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of ho hum about a universal basic income. Um, I think I favor the federal. Excuse me. I favor a federal jobs guarantee as well, a living wage, right? And I think that's more transformative than basically a UBI, whereby which you just give individuals some sort of supplemental income to kind of like bring up their spending power to a level that would be sufficient to sustain life, perhaps. But I think the argument that this would be helpful to people and that this would do something beneficial, transformative to our society, doesn't necessarily look at the efforts made by past programs that did something similar to basically do that. And I think the first thing I can think of is just like all the assistance programs that we have today that have been ravaged and withered. But even in their heyday, they didn't necessarily produce the effects that people are stating that the UBI would produce.
So one of the premises behind our existing array of social programs is that the person has to enter into poverty to be eligible to receive the benefits. Premise behind something like a federal job guarantee is we want to prevent poverty in the first place. We don't want anybody to have to be exposed to it. It depends on the magnitude of the universal basic income, whether or not it's truly a substitute for a federal job guarantee. But most proposals that I've seen suggest that every adult American would receive about $12,000 annually as an income supplement. And what I think that might do is simply subsidize the continuation of low wage employment.
Yeah.
I think that what a federal job guarantee would do, if the federal job guarantee was designed so that every recipient of employment by the federal government would get at least a non-poverty wage, federal job guarantee would compel the private sector to increase the compensation that they provide in the lowest paid jobs, because otherwise folks would take the public sector job.
Well,
so that's a really significant benefit of a federal job guarantee. But I would be open to a world in which you had both a federal job guarantee and a UBI. But I prefer a world where, if I have to choose, that I had the job guarantee without the UBI rather than the UBI without the job guarantee.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that even when you were talking right there, it's not just lifting up wages in the private sector. Like this could be used. They can hire professionals as well. This wouldn't be like menial work. This could be a real competitive infrastructure for across the board, not just at the bottom rung. Because you would need professionals to do things like administrate, plan, and make possible all the things that would need to be done by a federal jobs program to put people to work, right?
You would need professionals to actually train the participants in the federal job program as well. I don't think you can have people go out and build bridges or engage in elder care or child care without a substantial amount of previous training.
Yes. I mean, and in doing so, you'll be creating very, very well paid work for everyone. So I think that it would be basically a competitor for the private sector that doesn't currently exist. And that's a good thing for employment, not necessarily for employers, but employment. That's a good thing. So yes. I think we've kind of covered a broad range of topics of conversation. I remember last time it was very short, so we didn't really get to talk about everything I wanted to talk about. And I know I have my notes right here, and I kind of got all my bullet points, but there's like 2 or 3 things that I want to get to, but we're actually out of time. So I want to thank you for coming today and sharing your time with us, Professor. I also want you to, if you can, kind of give us a promo and tell us about your book that's coming out, if you have a title for it, or just tell us to be on the lookout for it. And then I guess we'll go ahead and close out.
Okay. Well, Nicholas, thank you for having me on. The book is going to be called From Here to Equality. It's going to be published by the UNC Press. And I don't want to be too egotistical about it, but I think it will be the most comprehensive case for reparations for Black Americans to date.
All right. So I'll probably add it to my list along with, Color of the Law, Black Wealth, White Wealth, and just add it to my list of books there that people need to engage in before they have conversations about why Black people don't need reparations or why it's not needed or we're doing fine now. There's a lot of literature out there in your research as well that says that's just not the case. And so we just need to start being aware of that, especially when we're trying to form coalitions. Anyway, I want to thank you for coming and tell everybody good night. Good night.
Okay, thank you. Good night.